Okay, now we're going to look at text in a 3D scene. So rather than using filters, we're going to create a, quote, real 3D scene. Now, let's define our terms. 3D in motion and other motion graphics application generally refers to the ability to move and rotate layers in 3D space. And in fact, you can always do that with motion. So for example, if I take this text layer here, it looks like I can only move it up and down or left and right. In other words, in X or in Y. Similarly, it looks like I can only rotate it in Z. And the reason this is rotating in Z, it's as if a pin were stuck right in the anchor point and I'm rotating it around that pin, that Z axis. But in fact, if we go to the inspector and look at the Properties tab, for position it looks like there's just X and Y, but if we pop it open we see there's a Z, so we can actually move that text in 3D space, so we're moving it towards us now rather than scaling it or away. And by the way, I should mention this while we're here. Notice when I move very close, it looks like it's very jagged here. Easy thing to address. In the Render pop-up menu, the default quality is set to normal, and that will get you the best performance. But when you're doing things like bringing objects like shapes or text very close to what is essentially a camera, going to best will fix that. So check it out. Now it's nice and smooth. So you can either change it here, or once you render out, you can choose to render at best quality in order to avoid these jaggies. Okay, I'm going to set that back to 0. So similar to position, rotation by default only shows in the inspector the ability to rotate around Z, but if we pop this open, we see X and Y, and we can drag in X to rotate the text around the X axis, which we've already played with, and around the Y axis. And of course, you could use keyframes or parameter behaviors to do animation on any of these, as you already know. One more thing to be aware of is the tool for making these changes in the canvas. So down here is the Adjust 3D Transform tool. If I select it or press Q, we get a new interface that shows a red, green, and blue arrow. And the red is the horizontal movement, Y is for moving vertically, and the blue arrow pointing right at us is for moving in Z space. So we can move in all 3 dimensions directly in the canvas, and then we have rotation handles, again, which we've already seen to allow us to rotate in Z here, in X here, or in Y here. So everything's already in 3D. The only real exception is that layers won't interact with each other. So for instance, when I rotate this text over, it's not interacting with this background layer at all. It should be kind of cutting into it, but it's not. And the reason for that is that this group is not a 3D group. And again, we've touched on this before. So if I make this a 3D group, you'll see all of a sudden that this text cuts into that layer behind it. And in fact, if I select the entire group and use this Adjust 3D tool, I can rotate it down, and we can see now that that text is cutting through that little generator that I've used for a color solid for a background. So I'll undo that, and I'll select the text and reset it. So to set up text in a 3D scene, one thing I like to do, just so we can see all the different tools that are available in 3D, is to throw a floor in here so the text is sitting on an actual floor. So what I'm going to do is I'll take this color solid here and I'll rename it back wall. I'll hit Command D to duplicate it, and I'm going to name the duplicate floor. And then right in the canvas, I'll hold the Shift key down and drag up on the Rotation X handle, which will snap rotation to exactly 90 degrees. In fact, just to check that, if we go to the Properties Inspector for rotation, we can see it's exactly -90. And then I'm going to drag down to move this down to be a floor. And then in the Generator Inspector, let's change the color to something else so it's clear that it's not the same as the wall behind it. So there we have our floor. And we have a 3D group. You can see it's 3D by the little stack icon, or if you select it and go to the Object menu, we can see 3D group is selected. So now with that text, I can drag it down and have it actually disappear inside that floor. Now to really see what's going on, it's best to add a camera at this point. So I'm going to click the little camera icon down here to add a camera. I'm going to assume you have some familiarity with the 3D controls in motion. We have a full tutorial on mastering the camera in motion, so I'll just quickly go over the different tools here. We've got options to pan, orbit, and dolly the scene here. So I'm going to just use these controls to get a little different view on what we're looking at. And then I'm going to select this floor and make it bigger. In fact, if I hold the Option key and I drag one handle, it'll drag in both sides. And by the same token, I'll select the back wall and make it taller, then hold the Option key and drag left, just so we have a bigger back wall and front wall. Then I'll take this text and let's also take the back wall and move it back away from the text, so it's not quite as close to the text. There's some distance between the two. And now if I take the text and drag down on it, we can see we can have it cut down into the floor. So I'll set it down right about matching the bottom of the floor. Now if we want to get back to original camera position, all we need to do is double click on any one of these tools up here to do so. Or if I move things and select the camera and go to the Properties Inspector for the camera, there we see the transformations of its position and rotation. We're going to hit the hooked arrow up here and we're back to where it started. However, I do want to kind of change this a little bit, give a little bit of distance like that, a little bit of an angle, change the position, and even the text itself we can rotate something like that. Okay, another way, by the way, to make sure the text is sitting exactly on the floor, because obviously I'm kind of estimating, but this text has an anchor point along its base, and this floor has a position X, Y, and Z, and I've actually moved it. If I drag in Y, we can see Y is determining how low that floor is. So if I'm going to take this Y parameter, I'm just going to take that letter Y and drag it right onto the text, and that drops the text down exactly touching the floor there. I'll select the text and rotate it a little bit like that. And then I'll tilt the camera down a little bit. And then just to make sure everything is expanded, I'll drag this out and I'll drag out the floor a little bit as well. Oops. We can't quite see the floor, so let me move over here. I have a little trouble grabbing that, so what I'll do in the Properties Inspector for its scale is just see which scale I need to increase. That a little more and that a little bit more. There we go. Okay, so I have text in a 3D scene, so now I can do all kinds of things in terms of camera animation or animating the text. But just to show you a few more things that will make it pop out a little bit more, is one thing I'm going to do is add a light to this scene. So under the Object menu, I'll choose New Light. And by default, this light, if I hit F7 to bring up the heads-up display, is a point light. So a point light's like a light bulb. It just spreads light out in all directions, and it decreases intensity as it moves away from an object. You see I'm just dragging it around, and I can also use my camera to see, my camera control, to see how close it is to the text. So I can use a point light, I can increase its intensity, and that's one option for kind of lighting up the text. Another option I like a little bit better is to change this point light to a spotlight. That's the light that you get the most control over. So I'm going to drag that spotlight back and up, tilt it down a little bit, and reduce the cone angle quite a bit, but then increase this soft edge. And that's kind of a nice way to light things in 3D in motion. I'll also increase its intensity. And then let's use this checkbox right here in the heads-up display to add shadows. And right away we can see that light now casts shadows on the text. If we move that light a little lower, we get longer shadows that start to creep up the wall. Let's move it even a little bit lower. And move this a little bit closer. And now we start to get something kind of interesting where we really do have text in a 3D scene with lighting. I'll hit F7 to close that, with lighting and shadows. A few more things, just if you haven't worked much with 3D, if I go to the inspector to the shadow section here, I'll click Show, there's an option to soften the shadows, and it goes to 20 by default, but you can crank it up quite a bit higher. Or what's kind of nice is if you uncheck uniform softness and then crank up the softness, it gets soft more towards the end of the shadows and stays sharp close by. The reason you might not always want to use this is because it really increases render times quite a bit. but it can make things look very nice. Let's also make this back wall a little bit closer just so we see the shadows creep up the wall a little bit more like that. There we go. And I'll select the light, and I'm going to turn uniform softness back on, and I'm also going to just decrease the softness. Okay, I've also noticed even though the text anchor point is exactly matching the floor, the text is cutting in a little bit, so I'll bump it up. There we go. Now there's actually one more component to 3D in a 3D scene, which is reflections. So if I select the floor and go to the Properties Inspector and scroll down, I have an option for reflection. So I'll enable that, and immediately everything gets reflected in the floor. 100%. Everything's reflected, and it's reflected quite dramatically. And now again we can see that our text is not quite touching when I moved it up. So I'll move it down just a little bit more right there. Select that floor again, and in this reflection, let's click Show to show all of the properties here. This is how reflective the floor is. I don't want it to be quite so reflective, and I really want fall off. So I'm going to click the checkbox here and open up the fall off parameter, because right now it's so reflective, it's like a mirror. And I'm going to adjust the end distance so it kind of disappears after a little while. The exponent value also allows you some control in how that kind of fades out, and it looks a little more realistic. There we go. We might add a little bit of blur also. You don't want to go too far, it really destroys the effect. But a little bit of blur can look pretty nice. There we go. So now it looks like some kind of soft surface. And with that, we have kind of a fun little 3D scene that we can animate the camera or animate the text. And everything still works that we're familiar with. For instance, let's select the text and go to the Behaviors pop-up menu and add a text animation, sequence text behavior. And to make this fast and easy, let's trim the sequence text. I'll press O to trim it out to about 2 seconds, then Option Command O for play range out point. And then I'm just going to take this first letter and drag it forward in Z space until everything's off the screen. And then press play. And we have kind of a neat animation there. Now, I always like to increase the spread, so let's go ahead and do that. I'll increase the spread to something like 7, make it a little smoother. And you may notice as the text comes in, these shadows actually are interactive. You can see the shadow from the A overlaps onto the shadow of the N, which I think is just really cool. So it gives it a very kind of realistic look. Let's play that through again. So I've got a nice little animation of some text coming on the screen. To finish this off, I might add a little behavior to the camera. So I'll select the camera, and from the Behaviors pop-up menu, I'll choose Camera, Sweep, and I'll press O to trim the sweep behavior. And then in the inspector, I'm going to set the end of the sweep to about here. And then I'll set the beginning. Let's just see what it looks like with the beginning where it is. Just gives a nice little move. Maybe I'll set the beginning to a slightly positive value. And then when we play through, let's also set the speed to ease both. So the camera comes to a nice smooth start and stop. And there we have a nice, simple animation of text in 3D with lights, shadows, and reflections.